Oh, I don't have my cheat sheet. Oh, I don't need it. Amory, Augusta, Clear Lake, and Ellsworth.
Okay, it says it's streaming.
All right, well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started tonight talking about managing weeds in yards, gardens, and landscapes. I'm Diane Alfuth. I'm the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for UW Extension, and I technically cover Pierce and St. Croix counties, but I also kind of cover the regional approach as well. And I'd like to thank the consortium of libraries that is hosting this, and specifically the Amory, Ellsworth, Clear Lake, and Augusta libraries, who are doing all the technical stuff here. And then the Augusta library is hosting the YouTube site. So if for any reason you can't stay for the whole thing and you want to watch it later, you can just go to that Augusta Public Library's YouTube site and watch it again. So it's warm out today. It's really windy, but it's very warm. And whenever things get above 55 degrees, nature starts happening. And that includes the insects, but it also includes weeds, which are just waiting to get started out there. So this is a good time of year to talk about weeds and think about the weeds in your yard and garden and develop your plan of attack for it, because weeds are way easier to deal with if you get at them early and they aren't allowed to get totally huge and overgrown. And then when that happens, we are starting to look forward to frost to kill them all off. And we don't want to be thinking about frost right now. So first, let's define what a weed is. And a weed is varies depending on who's looking at it. So it's kind of the in the eye of the beholder sort of a thing. And we always have to remember that one person's weed is another person's wildflower. So a lot of things that we call wildflowers or native flowers can also be weeds. And generally speaking, a weed is any plant that causes harm to people or animals. But then we have to define harm. And that is, again, a different perspective. Okay, so let me give you an example. I have horses, and everybody is very interested, all the kids and a lot of people are interested in monarch butterflies and providing milkweed for monarch butterflies. But milkweed is toxic to horses, and if horses eat a little, enough of it, it can kill them. So certainly I want to support monarch butterflies, but I also don't want my paint horses to get sick. So while some people look at milkweed as a wildflower and a pollinator plant, I look at it as that's fine in the ditches and off in the fallow fields, but I don't want it in my pasture or my hayfield because there it's a weed. So we have to keep that in mind when we start bashing weeds or whatever, is that not everyone's perspective is the same. And also with the concerns about effective weed control on the environment, the need for pollinator plants for certain pollinating insects and stuff, attitudes in society towards different weeds and in different situations are changing. So I don't want to say that it's a political thing, but in a small way, it's a political thing. So we really need to be aware of that. But the reason we don't like weeds, the main thing when we're talking to gardeners is because they compete with our desired plants, and they compete for space, and they compete for nutrients and water. And so if we're going to have fewer tomatoes because of weeds growing there, that's not going to make us happy. Also, weeds look, well, weedy, right? And so you've heard people talk about an area that looks weedy or whatever. I should, as another example, I have a prairie, an area that once was farmland, rented out to neighboring farmers, and we decided to plant it into prairie restoration. And so one of our neighboring farmers calls it, quote, the weed patch, because it's not corn or soybeans, but it looks weedy to him. And everyone is entitled to their opinion. But we also have to be concerned about weeds because they can harbor diseases and insect pests that bother our desirable plants or people themselves. So again, remember, a weed is something that causes harm to people or animals. Weeds are very successful. Basically, when we call something a weed, it's because it is so successful. And we talk about things as being weedy, meaning they can fill in an area fast or spread really fast. And that's because nature wants that to happen. Nature does not like a void. So nature doesn't like it if there is a bare soil area. And that's not good if there is. So nature sends something in, and weeds that produce a lot of seeds and can germinate quickly and be adapted to the area are what happens. So nature just knows what's going to grow in that area, and in it comes. And those weeds are able to take advantage of that opportunity, that void that was produced there. And weeds can produce a lot of seeds, and we'll talk about this shortly. But weeds are very successful. If you ever think you're going to get rid of weeds and not have weeds, it's never going to happen. Okay. So what we have to do is learn to live with them and learn to manage them so that we can do it in the most environmentally friendly way with the least amount of effort and the least amount of money put into it. And sometimes that means just accepting that some of those weeds are going to grow there. So here's an example of another reason to control weeds, especially if we're talking about a vegetable garden. So on the right, you see early blight. It's a tomato disease that affects a lot of people who are a lot of tomatoes in people's gardens. And that's going to lower production. But on the left is a weed, a nightshade weed. So it's in the same family as the tomatoes, and that's Septoria leaf spot on it. And so the weed can serve as a host for that disease. And so we want to make sure that we control any nightshade weeds that are anywhere near where tomatoes will be grown so that we can control that disease and not have it persist in our garden. Weeds can also basically knock out other weeds. So there's a property called allelopathy, and that's when a particular plant gives off some kind of compound that is meant to reduce the competition. So it's a compound that's usually in the soil, and it stops other weeds or other plants, I should say, from germinating or from growing well. The most common one that we have around and that you may have heard of is black walnut. And black walnut, here's a black walnut tree on the right, and it has a compound in it called juglone, Juglone, and it's exuded by the roots. It's also in the nuts and the leaves. So as those fall to the ground and decompose, some of it can be released, and it stops a lot of things from growing, specifically tomatoes. So if you have a black walnut tree near your garden, you're not going to be able to grow tomatoes successfully. They'll grow for a little while and then the plant wilts. It looks like it has no water, but it's plenty wet, but it's the juglone doing that. And this again is nature's way of keeping out the competition. But some of our common weeds that we see in our gardens are also very allelopathic. Ragweed up at the top here is one of them. You all have that. And if you sneeze a lot in fall when that stuff starts blooming, you know ragweed is around. And then purslane down here in the bottom left, that's another one. And that's actually edible. It's a great little edible addition to your salads. But when you see that, you often see it growing all over the ground and there's nothing else growing there. And so there aren't any other weeds. And that's because the purslane is keeping them out because it's allelopathic. So weeds tend to produce a lot of seeds, and that's why they can fill in an area very quickly and why we'll never get rid of them. So if you look at red root pigweed, which is a common weed that we have, one plant can produce easily 230,000 babies. Okay, common lamb's quarter, 38,000. Green foxtail is the biggest weed in my garden. That's the picture on the right. And one plant can shoot up to 4,000 seeds out, and it literally shoots them when they're ready to, when they're ripe. Those seed heads will actually kind of shoot those seeds out so that they spread several feet. And that's why it's so prevalent in my garden, because those seeds are everywhere if I let them go to seed. Okay, so weeds produce a lot of seeds, and they also live a long time. So the longevity of some of these weeds is really significantly long. So you can see that on that green foxtail that after 17 years, 5% of them are still viable. So while a lot of them will get eaten by insects or birds or something like that in the ground, or they might rot away, or they might wash away, or they might germinate and then the little plants get killed or whatever, 5% of them are going to be there 17 years later. So that's what I mean. We'll never not have weeds, but we have to manage those weed seeds that are persisting in our soil. Now, there are good things about weeds, okay? I like to look at the pros as well as the cons. Weeds can quickly colonize bare soil, and that's a good thing to reduce erosion. So sometimes, you know, like in the wildfires out west, or if we have a flood around here and something washes out, anything that's going to colonize that soil is a good thing. And a lot of times it's weeds, right? Tomatoes don't tend to do that. Weeds can also have very pretty flowers, and those flowers are good for pollinators. So in the bottom right there, you can see that's Creeping Charlie, and you probably all know Creeping Charlie, but that's one of the first things blooming in the spring, and the bees are really, really happy to have it. So just because it's a weed doesn't mean that pollen in those flowers isn't good for pollinators. A lot of weeds are just eaten by wildlife. Stinging nettle, which is the picture in the top right, it's a stinging nettle patch starting to grow there. That's the food for, it's either painted lady or red admiral butterflies. I always mix those two up. But the larvae eat that stuff. And we like those butterflies around. Lots of weeds are also edible for people, including stinging nettles. When they're young and short, you get them and then you steam them and the little stinger prickle things disappear, and they're super high in vitamins. And like I mentioned earlier, purslane is edible. So some of these weeds are actually food for people. And of course, pulling those weeds or eliminating those weeds provides some good exercise for people as well. Maybe not the best way to look at them, but again, weeds aren't all bad. And that's why we really have to kind of look at weeds where they are and not think, oh, we have to eliminate every single weed that's out there. So we have to find a balance. There's that milkweed on the right. So again, if that's growing out in the field and not near horses, or other mammals, actually it's toxic to pretty much anything with a heart. But as long as it's not in the pasture or in the hay, then it can be out there to feed the monarch caterpillars. So not every weed needs to be removed, but we do need to kind of find that balance, and then we have to find the balance on how to control them. So the first step is to identify your weed. Weeds can be put into several different categories. We usually start out by saying if it's a grassy weed or a broadleaf weed. And a broadleaf weed, sorry, I'm trying to find my cursor here. So in this picture, you can see in the middle there's a big weedy grass, and that's either crabgrass or orchard grass. I can't tell for sure from this picture until it sends out some seed heads. But also next to it down here is some oxalis. It looks like little leprechaun clovery sorts of things. There's also, I think, a little bit of knotweed in here. but those are not grassy weeds. And so those are called broadleaf weeds. And it's important to identify if it's a grass weed or a broadleaf weed, because that's going to help you to decide on its life cycle and then the control of it. So another way that these are more technically categorized is as a monocot or a dicot. So grasses are monocots, broadleaf weeds are dicots. And this is important, not if you're doing the pull it up and throw it away type of weed removal, but if you ever get into using any herbicides, herbicides are often specific to one or the other. They kill just monocots and not dicots, or just dicots and not monocots. And that's why we want to make sure that we're putting them in that correct category. So here's a picture of monocots and dicots. And in the top, you'll see that a monocot is kind of like a corn seed, where when that seed germinates, only one blade comes out. And the veins on the leaves are usually really parallel, long and parallel to the sides of the leaf. In contrast, the dicot, which is a broadleaf plant, so your creeping Charlie, your dandelions, your plantain, your lamb's quarter, they will have two cotyledons. So when the seed comes up kind of like the slide picture in the top left there, there's two leaves. Those are cotyledon leaves. Those are two cotyledons. And so that's a dicot in the top left there. The leaves usually have veins that are more net-like rather than parallel to the edges. The vascular bundles inside you'd have to be looking at with a microscope or a hand lens to know the difference. But monocots typically have a more fibrous root system versus, so that's like a grass root system goes out more fibrous than a taproot. And then if you're looking at the floral parts, things are usually in multiples of three. So 3 petals, 3 sepals, whereas if it's in 4s or 5s, it's most likely a dicot. And again, this is important mostly when you get into dealing with herbicides, but still also helpful in identifying the plants. So just like our desired plants, our vegetables and flowers, weeds follow the same life cycle. So annual weeds are a weed that will germinate and in spring, so pretty soon here, as soon as the soil is warm enough for them, they grow very fast. They get leaves, then they flower, they set seed, and then they die. So they go from seed to seed in 1 year. Some of them can be winter annuals, meaning they germinated last fall and they hung around in the winter under the snow, and now they're going to continue on their life cycle. They're going to set flower and set seed and die. And those are some of the ones that really flower early. So if you ever see like little yellow flowers blooming super, super early, those are probably in the mustard family. And shepherd's purse is another one. That one gets white flowers usually. Those are winter annuals. Okay, but they're going to die. That plant's going to die after it flowers and sets seed. So if you know that, then there's no reason to worry about controlling them. Or if you're going to control those particular weeds for the future, you need to keep them from setting seed. So once they're flowering, if you can mow them off, if you can, whatever you can do to keep them from setting seed, then you're protecting against next year's weeds, okay? Annuals typically have a pretty shallow root system. So if we have a really bad drought, just like your lawn or anything else that you're growing, annual weeds will die off. Biennials are weeds that grow, the seed will germinate usually in spring. The first year it just grows some foliage. Usually it's in a rosette form down near the soil surface. And that's what's up here in the top right is a burdock plant. So burdock is a nasty little weed that gets those stickers on it that get stuck in your dog's coat or your socks or your horse's tail. And but the first year it just looks like this, flat and grown down to the ground. And what it's doing is it's just storing energy in a big old taproot down there, which by the way is edible. But it will go through the winter like this. this is what it'll look like as spring comes along and it starts growing, and then it'll grow a taller stalk. It'll send up the flower heads and the seeds, and then it will die. So if you have a burdock or any biennial that has flowered, that plant is now going to be dead. So there's no reason to dig it out or pull it out or spray it with an herbicide. It's going to be a goner. And that, again, is why it's so important to identify the weeds. Perennial weeds, of course, are those that usually the first year they'll grow small, like a rosette, kind of like the biennial. They're putting a lot of energy into the root system. And then the second year, they'll flower, they'll set seed, and they'll continue to do that year after year. And those are the ones that tend to be the harder ones for us to get control of. And again, if we can identify it, know its life cycle, and then figure out what the best way to control it is, then we're going to have a lot more success. So we really should take an integrated weed management approach, okay? And what that means is we don't just nuke every weed we find, and we don't just let every weed we find go. We need to use all the different tools available to manage them in an economical and environmentally safe manner. Okay, so again, there's a lot of interest and a lot of concern about using herbicides willy-nilly in the landscape, and not only for the environmental health, but our own public health as we get exposed to things like that. So we want to be careful about that. But that is a tool that in some cases might be better than not controlling that weed at all. So we're going to talk about the integrated weed management approach. So prevention. Prevention is where we really need to set our minds, and that's why it's so important that we're looking at this time of year, because like I said, things haven't really started to germinate out there. I have seen the little rosettes of winter annuals, shepherd's purse, and the mustards out there already. They're green, and they're going to be shooting up a flower stalk pretty soon here, as soon as they get enough warmth. But most of the annuals or biennials or perennials that set seed last year, and those seeds have been laying on the soil, they haven't germinated yet. So one of the things that we want to do is prevent weeds from flowering and setting seed, because you can't grow a weed if you don't have a seed. So many times the control is if you can mow them off or string trim them off or hedge trim them off when they are flowering, before they set viable mature seed, then you won't have as many weeds to deal with later. Okay. The next thing is to not let the seeds germinate. And for any seed to germinate, whether it's a tomato or a carrot or a lamb's quarter, those seeds need to have soil contact. So they need to be actually contacting the soil so they can soak up some moisture, and they have to have light. So they need to, if it's a full sun weed like a dandelion, it's not, if it finds itself in the dark, either because it's been buried too deep or it blew into a deep dark forest, it won't even try to germinate. So the seeds can sense how much light there is and whether it's in sun or shade. And if it's a full sun plant like a dandelion and it's in the shade, it will just lay there and not germinate, and it'll hope for a storm to come along and blow down a tree and open up a canopy and get light down in there, because that dandelion knows that if it germinates in the shade, it won't be able to survive because it needs full sun. So the same can be done with us. We have to remember that in a handful of soil, there are thousands of seeds, thousands of weed seeds in there. And that's why anytime that you work up your soil, like your garden or a new place or whatever, all of a sudden, poof, you get all these little weeds that are growing there. And that's because those seeds have been sitting in that soil waiting for just the right conditions, waiting for a gopher to come and till up the soil and bring them to the surface. So if we can keep those seeds in the dark and in that soil so that the conditions are not right for germination, then we're going to prevent those weeds in the first place. And you can also, in some cases, use pre-emergent herbicides. And we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but pre-emergent herbicides are herbicides that stop seeds from germinating. And basically, when that seed soaks up water and starts sending out its first little root, the herbicide kills that root off so that the plant can't grow. And in some cases, those are very, very useful. But if we can prevent the weeds in the first place through mulching, through not giving them the right conditions, or from using pre-emergent herbicides, then we don't have to pull them or control them later. So with annual weeds, those are the easiest ones. They produce a ton of seeds. Okay, they produce lots and lots of seeds. So you can have a lot of these little annuals sprouting early in the summer, but they have their growing point most of the time up at the top of the plant. Okay, sometimes they have a few little latent buds down where the leaves attach to the stem. But if you mow these things off, kind of off with their head down to here, that plant is dead, okay? Because there are no growing points below this spot. And that root is not going to shoot up any new growth. Okay, so most of the annuals is just like if you mowed off your petunias or your marigolds, they die because you've mowed off the growing points. So if you can take off their heads or their feet, which would be like with, like if you rototilled or use a hoe or anything that disturbs the soil and those roots get pulled out, they are not likely going to resprout. Okay, annuals just don't have much energy stored in the roots like a perennial does, because those roots just grew this year when that seed germinated. And so that seed has been putting all of its attention on the top growth, and it's just grown a relatively shallow little root underneath with not a lot of energy stored in it. So if you disturb it, it's just like if you disturb your lettuce seed in your vegetable garden, it will die. Okay. You can also smother annual weeds very easily. So if you were to put 3 to 4 inches of a mulch, like dried grass clippings or chopped leaves left over from last year, or pine needles or straw, if you put 3 to 4 inches over the soil, any of those annual weed seeds that are down there, they're not likely to sprout because they're too much in the dark, and they know that. So they won't even germinate because they know there's not enough energy in that seed to make it up to the surface to where they can be doing photosynthesis. So you can smother them out. Also, if you have tiny little annual weeds that have already germinated, kind of like the slide picture in the top left there, if you've got little annual weeds, if you put enough mulch over the top or maybe some cardboard or something like that, that will smother them and kill them as well. Biennials are similar. Okay, so when they're in that first year, you can take off their top. If you, with a biennial, so on the left or on the right here is a picture of a carrot, right? But carrots are biennials, and so are things, like I said, like burdock and wild parsnip and stuff like that. If you can cut that weed off, that taproot about an inch or two below the soil. So if you just took a shovel and you just sliced through it right here, that will kill that plant. Okay, there's the roots below it don't have the growing points to grow back up again. If you were to cut this plant off right here above the crown, then there's enough growing points and energy in the crown of that plant that it would shoot back up. But if you slice it off a couple inches below the ground, it will die. Okay, so biennials you can do that way. You can smother them a lot of times as well, especially when they're small. If you just put a couple inches of like loose grass clippings on it, it might not be enough because this plant has a big taproot with a lot of energy in it. But if you put a piece of cardboard over it and then topped it with 3 or 4 inches of grass clippings or something, you're most likely going to smother it. And you can also control these with an herbicide in their first year or the early part of their second year. You can spritz them with an herbicide and they will die, and then you never get the seeds and the flowers coming up. And this can be important if you have, like a massive patch of burdock, for example. Going in there and slicing each one off 2 inches below the surface might not be doable. And that might be a justified time to use an herbicide to kill those first year plants so that they don't grow up and set seed the next year. Perennials, you kind of have to dig out, and that works most of the time, okay? But there are some that if you don't get the whole root, they will grow back. Quackgrass is the biggest one, okay? That can be a weed that because of the rhizomes and the roots, they spread through. And if you pull it up in one place, you've left a lot of root in there and it just sprouts right back up, okay? Dandelions, there is a belief that if you don't get the entire root, it will grow back. That's not totally true. If you broke it off halfway down, kind of like that biennial, it's probably going to be dead. But it is true that if you just break off the top near the soil surface, it will grow back because there is an extensive root there, and nature wants it to grow back, right? You can smother a lot of perennials. I know people will put down like black plastic, but with perennials, because there's so much energy in those root systems, you have to put it down for a long period of time. So we're talking like 6 weeks that you would have to put black plastic down or carpet or something to smother that area. If you have something really noxious, okay, so quackgrass is one of them, but even worse is Canada thistle, and that's what this picture on the left here is. This is a patch of Canada thistle, and it spreads by underground roots as well as by seeds. This is super, super difficult to get control of, and smothering it is not real effective. If ever there was a reason for the use of herbicides, this is one that would be it. Canada thistle is considered a noxious weed on Wisconsin's noxious weed list. It is a major problem because it takes over pastures for cattle and other livestock. Obviously, it pokes, so it's nasty for people and kids and that sort of thing. And it's really hard to get control of, and digging it out or pulling it is not very effective because of these long roots that can grow for feet underground, and then they'll shoot up more leaves, and there's just so much of a energy store in those roots. Okay, so perennials are the hardest one to get control of, and for the most part, annuals and even biennials you can usually control really easily without herbicides. Perennials, that's the ones where herbicides can be the important tool in the toolkit. Okay, so here's smothering again. This is in a vegetable garden setting where you can put down a weed barrier, so it can be a fabric weed barrier that's made for that. And because it puts the soil in the dark, any of the weed seeds that are down there underneath that aren't going to germinate. And they're, if they do germinate, they're just going to die under there. So you can use newspaper. It needs to be 5 to 6, more like 6 to 7 sheets thick. Not one sheet. One sheet won't do it. Things will grow through that. You can use brown corrugated cardboard. If it's a temporary thing, you can put down boards or old carpet or black plastic. Geofabrics are things that are made specifically for it. Organic mulch, you don't need something underneath it. If you put shredded wood, pine needles, leaves, straw, grass clippings, those kinds of things, if you put it deep enough so that light can't filter through it and get to the soil, that's usable too. But you're going to have to be thinking about 4 inches. You have to make sure that you really got that soil covered. And remember that organic mulch is going to decompose as it's exposed to the moisture there. So that layer is going to get thinner and thinner. So you might have to top it off after a month or so. But if you put down cardboard or something first, that usually will get you through the whole season before that cardboard decomposes. And so this is a really effective way to smother things as well. If you are doing a shrub or perennial bed and you're putting down like shredded wood mulch, which is a really common and good thing to do, never put a synthetic weed barrier under it. Now, I know a lot of landscapers even do this. The weed fabric barriers, fabric weed barrier things that you buy, do not put that down and then put shredded wood on top of it, because what happens is that shredded wood will decompose as it's exposed to moisture and stuff, and it decomposes on top of that weed barrier. And then you have this wonderful little layer of compost where seeds that blow in and land on top will germinate. And so after a year or two, that weed barrier that's under there is doing absolutely nothing, except causing a problem because it starts to become visible. Weeds can grow right through it, and then you pull them out, and then that's stuff flapping in the wind, that sort of thing. So organic mulch is going to decompose. Always remember that. And it's going to create a good seed bed. So that's why you're going to, if you just put down shredded wood in your shrub and perennial beds, put it down 4 inches thick, but then just know that every 2 years or so, you're going to have to put another inch on top to top dress it and add to that layer and keep the weeds from sprouting. Okay, so let's talk about vegetable weeds, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind is where the weed is growing might inform how we want to control that weed. Okay, so most people garden because they want fresh, healthy vegetables and don't really want to use any kind of chemicals or herbicides in the vegetable garden. Okay, whereas maybe on that Canada thistle patch, it's not such a big deal, right? So the biggest thing for vegetables is that it's really disheartening if by August you're looking at a massive weed patch because you weren't able to keep up with them. So doing things from the start to prevent the weeds is super, super, super important. First thing is to make sure you keep your garden to a manageable size. If you plant too big of a garden, you aren't going to be able to keep up with it, and then things get out of control. So the biggest thing again is remember to prevent your weeds from going to seed. So if you do get behind and you have things flowering like my foxtail in my garden, even if you can go in there with a string trimmer or a mower and mow it down. And that's often what happens is, so if you plant your early season crops like peas and then they're done and they're harvested, well, now you've got a bare patch in your garden, and it's really easy to just let it grow up into some weeds because, you know, there's no crop there anymore. But then those weeds set seed and they spew out all over your garden. So prevent them from going to seed. If you have any kind of bare soil, cover it. Cover it with something. I don't care what it is. If it's newspaper or cardboard or straw or clippings or leaves, pine needles, if you have them available, are great mulch. Anything you can do to cover the soil, because remember, there's gazillions of weed seeds in that soil. And if that soil is exposed, those weed seeds are going to sprout. You can also use plastic mulch, like in the top right picture. That is, again, stopping weed seeds that are in the soil from germinating. Just make sure that you manage that. It's usually best if you put that black plastic on. So black plastic absorbs heat. It's going to absorb the sun. It's going to really warm up that soil. So if you're trying to warm up your soil in the early spring so that it's a higher temperature for your roots, for your tomatoes and things, that's fine. But once we start getting into hotter weather, make sure you put some kind of mulch on top of that black so that it doesn't absorb that much heat, because you can actually burn or stress your roots from too much heat as well if you overdo it. So manage any plastic mulch for heat buildup. The problem with plastic mulch is you need to pick it up at the end of the year. And by that point, especially if it has been exposed to sunlight and the UV rays, it starts to break apart and you've got a mess, and then you've got pieces of plastic in your soil forever and that sort of thing. That's why if you use cardboard or newspaper, it's so great, because those are organic, okay? They were made from trees. And as the year goes on, they will decompose. And by the end of the year, you can just work that into the soil and it actually adds some organic matter. So, and you don't have to worry about the inks. Those are all soy-based inks these days. So, so it's a very useful way to control weeds, and it actually adds some organic matter. If you prefer to use the plastic stuff, that's your choice, but just remember that you got to pick that stuff up at the end of the year. Now there is one pre-emergent herbicide that you can use in the vegetable garden that's organic, and the product is actually corn gluten meal. And this is the byproduct of the corn milling process, and they accidentally found that it stops weed seeds from germinating, just like the chemical pre-emergent herbicides do. And that's what it looks like on the left, and you just sprinkle it around your plants. So this, remember, will stop all seeds from germinating. So you do not want to put this in the soil and then plant your carrots, because your carrots aren't going to germinate. But this is something that you can put around like your tomato transplants or your broccoli transplants, or after your seeds have grown and they're a couple inches high, you can go and put it in there. So this again is pretty effective. It's not 100%, but it's going to stop a lot of weed seeds from germinating. Now, it's useful, okay, and it's probably best if you use it in the areas where you're not able to mulch, okay, because so like you might put down the cardboard down your rows and stuff, and then after your beans grow up a couple inches, you might sprinkle this in between the bean plants so that you don't have to pull the weeds that grow up within the row, because otherwise you're spending money on corn gluten meal, whereas the cardboard and the newspaper and the mulch stuff works really, really well for the larger exposed areas. Okay. In perennial beds or shrub beds, think kind of long-term. So when you first plant something, a shrub bed or perennial bed, there's a lot of space in between those plants. And that's the place where weeds can grow up because it's exposed to the sunlight. But eventually your plants should start like touching each other pretty much. Not that they're crowded, but like in the top right there, those plants aren't crowded, but they're shading most of the soil in between the plants. And that is going to stop weed seeds from germinating in those areas, okay? So closing that canopy, planting the right spacing so that it gets shaded out really, really is helpful, especially with shrubs as they get bigger. You can use a pre-emergent herbicide, just like I was just talking about. That preen corn gluten meal that I mentioned is the organic kind, but there's a chemical kind of preen that was available long before the corn gluten, and that is more effective than the corn gluten. And you can sprinkle that in between your perennials and shrubs and stuff just as they're starting to emerge in the spring. It won't hurt the perennials, but it'll stop weed seeds from germinating. So that's a really good use for a pre-emergent herbicide. Again, it's maybe you don't want to use a chemical, then you could use the corn gluten meal one, but some people don't have as big of a problem using a chemical in an ornamental bed versus in the vegetable bed. You can also mulch them and smother the weeds. Again, if you put an inch or two of shredded wood on top of your mulch every other year, that's going to keep most of the weeds from sprouting up in there. And then there are also spray herbicides that are not pre-emergent that you can use to go spot spray any nasty weeds that grow up in there. Now you have to be really careful you don't get it on your ornamental plants because it will kill them as well. Herbicides can't tell the difference between a weed and a desired plant. So if you do that, because you have, let's say you have a little Canada thistle patch popping up in your perennial bed, you can go in there and just spritz the Canada thistle. You can paint it on with a paintbrush so that you don't get it on your other plants. And if you get quackgrass growing in your perennials and you can't dig it out good, there are herbicides that kill just grasses and not the dicots, the broadleaf plants. Okay, so again, that's why it's important to know what kind of weed you have as well as what kind of plants you're growing. So in lawns, there will always be some weeds, and there's a lot of changing attitudes on how perfect a lawn has to be when people are planting straight clover and letting things get weedy. So everybody has a different perspective on that, but there's nothing wrong with wanting a nice looking lawn. And it's actually environmentally better to have a healthy looking lawn with a few weeds in it than to have nothing but weeds, because grass is better at holding the soil and preventing runoff and erosion than a dandelion patch or a creeping Charlie patch or even a low growing white clover patch is. So the thing to keep in mind is that we don't have to have a totally weed-free lawn. And the better you keep your lawn healthy, the less weeds you're going to have. So a weedy lawn, it's not, a weedy lawn is a symptom of an unhealthy grass, turf grass lawn. Okay, so if you're having a lot of problems with weeds, then we need to talk about how you're managing your lawn and your turf grass. And if we can adjust that, you're going to have a lot fewer weeds. Okay, so the first step in that is fertilizing at least once a year. So sometimes people are concerned about the environmental impacts of putting fertilizer on, but again, a weedy, unhealthy lawn is more of an environmental problem than at least halfway healthy lawn that gets fertilized at least once a year. So you should fertilize at least once in September. If you're on a sandy soil, you really need to look at a September and then a Memorial Day fertilization to have a healthy lawn. If you don't have a healthy lawn, the weeds will move in. Okay, thick grass will cover the soil so that any weed seeds that blow in, those dandelions that blow in from the neighbors, if they get down to the soil, they can germinate. If the grass is thick, they don't find their way down to the soil, or if they get down there, it's too dark to germinate. So you should do a soil test once every 5 years to make sure where your fertility is and what you need for fertilizers, and also for checking the pH to make sure that that's in line for growing a lawn. You also want to avoid compaction. So every time you walk across your lawn or ride across it or the kids play on it, it compacts the soil, and grass doesn't like compacted soil, but weeds can colonize those areas. So if you have an area that's really weedy, especially if you have plantain in there or clover, those are weeds that handle the compacted soil. So the best thing to do would be to aerate the lawn and loosen that up some. And then again, looking at the fertility and other management processes, and then you can eliminate a lot of the weeds that are going to grow in that area. Mow higher. So everybody, before you go out and mow your lawn for the first time this year, you should go out and set your mower at its highest setting. My John Deere tractor says that my highest setting is like 4 or 4.5 inches, and it's cranked all the way up there. The taller your grass, the less weeds you're going to have, because taller grass means deeper roots, and a healthier grass, it shades it. So again, any weed seeds that make their way down to the soil, they're going to be in the dark. Okay. And it's really important that you follow the 1/3 rule for mowing. Now, a lot of times people say, well, I mow shorter because then I don't have to mow as often, but that's not actually true. You should mow your lawn when it is 1/3 higher than you want it to be. So if you want it to be 4 inches, when it gets 6 inches, you should mow it down to 4 inches. And the reason that's important is if you mow it, if you let it get 6 inches, which it can do really fast in the spring, right? If you let it get 6 inches and you mow it down to 2.5 inches, you're cutting into the stem and there are no grass blades there yet. So now you've really opened up the soil, and the weeds can get down in there. And it stresses your grass plant because there's so much grass blade to grow back up now. So, and it takes, so if you follow the 1/3 rule. Your grass is going to be healthier, you'll have less weeds, and you should have taller grass. It's not the height of the grass that makes it look so nice when it's freshly mowed. It's the fact that it's nice and uniform, and lushness comes with some height to it. So mow at your highest setting. And that grass then is going to have deeper roots, because more grass blade means more photosynthesis, which means more food to grow bigger, deeper roots. So then when we get those dry spells, especially in July and August, that grass is able to withstand that dry spell way better than a shorter grass will. It won't turn brown as fast. And again, it'll be able to compete with weeds better. Crabgrass is something, is kind of like a big weed that people treat for and put on crabgrass preventer to prevent. But if your lawn is healthy, especially if it's mowed high, you're not going to have crabgrass. Okay, because crabgrass is an annual grass. It grows in full sun. So that crabgrass seed needs to be at the soil where it can germinate, and it has to be getting enough light. If your grass is tall and nice and thick, those crabgrass seeds never germinate. So the only place you might have it would be maybe like along the edge of the sidewalk or driveway, where it tends to get hotter from the pavement or drought stress, that sort of a thing. So if you do have some crabgrass there, if you're using a crabgrass preventer, just put it in the areas where you expect to have crabgrass. You probably don't need it on the full lawn if you're managing that lawn well. So again, herbicides are a tool, but let's use them smart and only when they're really, really needed. And again, that might be along walkways or driveways and not over the entire part of your lawn if you're managing your lawn properly with at least one fertilization and mowing it high. Okay. Things like dandelions and plantain and clover in lawns, it's a really good idea to keep up with it so they don't take over. And so if you can remove individual ones as they occur, you can dig them out. Of course, there are all kinds of fun little dandelion diggers and things like that. We don't all want to do that, but putting a weed killer on your lawn when only 5% of it is actually weeds, you're wasting 95% of that weed killer and exposing the environment to that herbicide. So it's a lot better if you go out maybe once a month with your little spot sprayer and walk through, and if dandelions bother you, spritz each little dandelion with that weed killer, and then you're not putting it over the entire lawn area. But if you get them when they're individuals before all of a sudden your whole lawn is looking weedy, they won't bother you as much, okay? So there are different lawn weed herbicides, and this is where, again, that comes in, that monocot dicot thing, because grass is a monocot. So the weed killers that we use on lawns are broadleaf weed killers, meaning they're dicot killers. And that's why it kills dandelions and creeping Charlie and things in the lawn, because this will kill only things that are dicots. Now, it will not kill weedy grasses. So that's why it doesn't kill crabgrass after it's germinated, and why you have to put a crabgrass preventer on. But the best thing to do, again, is to spot spray. The best time, the most effective time for any herbicide, really, but especially these broadleaf weed killers, is in early fall around Labor Day, because the weeds are starting, those perennial dandelions and stuff are starting to send their energy down to the roots to store for winter. And so the herbicide goes down with it and kills the roots. And then the stress of winter gives it the final punch. And if you do that, then come springtime right now, you really shouldn't have any weeds in your lawn. So you don't need to be putting on a weed killer in spring, because you shouldn't have any weeds, right? And weed and feed products are not recommended. I know there's a lot of them out there, but they're not as effective for killing weeds. You should be weeding and feeding at different times as well, so you're not getting the best of either of them. They're difficult to get good coverage. They're really, they need to stick on the leaves for a certain amount of time. And again, you're treating the entire lawn, even though you might have just a few weeds. Weed and feed does not prevent weeds. It only kills weeds that are there. Okay, and that's with everything other than the crabgrass preventer. If it's not a pre-emergent, it does not prevent future weeds. It only kills the weeds that are there. And so the minute you put on your weed and feed, 2 days later, a weed seed can germinate and it's not going to be controlled by that. So really be careful with how much weed killer you're putting on, and try to avoid the weed and feed products. Weedy grasses, there are lots of different kinds of grasses, and they will come into your lawn and make it not look so great. And these are hard to get rid of because there's no herbicide that's going to know what's a weedy grass and what's your good grass. So you can use something like Roundup, a glyphosate is the active ingredient, and you can just spot spray these weedy things, or you can wipe it on, put on a rubber glove, put on a cloth glove, spritz the herbicide on your finger, wipe it on the weedy grass blades, and it will get into that grass blade and work its way down into the root and kill that weedy grass, and it will not affect your desired grasses. Okay, if you have a big patch of it, you may as well just either dig it all up or kill it all off and reseed the area. Those are harder to deal with when they're a grass. Okay. Creeping Charlie, yes, it can be killed by broadleaf herbicides, and 2,4-D, our normal dandelion lawn weed killer herbicides, is effective on it, but you need to treat it in the spring while it's still in flowering, or in the fall. And sometimes you have to do both to knock it out. But remember that Creeping Charlie flowers and it sets seeds. So even if you kill off everything that's there, you can have resprouts by new seeds. And again, if you get that lawn nice and thick and healthy and mow higher, you're going to have a lot less problem with Creeping Charlie. So herbicides, I just want to talk for a minute about herbicides because, again, they are a tool. We shouldn't use them unless we have to, but in some cases, they might be justified. Just make sure that you use them appropriately. So when you buy an herbicide or any kind of a pesticide and you decide to use it, what it says on the label is a legally binding document that you have to follow. Okay, so you must read that label and you must use these products as said on the label. There's only 4 ways you can do it. You can deviate from that. You can apply less than it tells you to. Probably not a great idea because you might not be effective. You can put it to a target pest not listed on the label as long as the site's listed. So maybe it doesn't list giant ragweed on the label, but you've got giant ragweed in your lawn. If it says that it's for use in lawns, you could still use it. You can apply it by any method not prohibited on the label. So as long as it doesn't say, do not use a paintbrush, you could use a paintbrush, okay? And then usually you can add fertilizer to the tank too if you wanted to fertilize at the same time. Not usually recommended in a home setting. More is not better, okay? I repeat, more is not better. So do not read the label. And if it says 4 ounces per 1 gallon of water, do not put 6 ounces in. Okay, that is not better. Not only can you damage your desired plants, but it's wasteful and it's environmentally not friendly. Okay, remember that these manufacturers want you to be successful with their product because then you're going to buy it again. So the instructions that they're giving you are plenty strong to kill whatever it is you're trying to kill. Okay, so always follow those mixing and application instructions and do not deviate from the label. Okay, contact herbicides are ones that when it sprays on it, it kills what it comes in contact with. Okay, if it's an annual, that's going to kill the root as well because annuals don't have growing points coming up from the roots. Some biennials it will also kill. Systemic herbicides are those that get on the leaf and then they go into the leaf tissue and they work their way down throughout the whole plant and then kill the plant. Okay, so make sure you know what your herbicide is that you're using. Okay, pre-emergent herbicides we've talked about a little bit already. So preen and green is basically preen with fertilizer in it. Okay, these are available. Again, always read the labels, and these have to be applied before the seeds germinate. They will not kill an existing live weed. Okay. Crabgrass preventer, Again, this is a chemical. Pendimethalin is usually what's in there, and it has to be put on before the crabgrass seeds germinate. And crabgrass seeds germinate when the soil 2 inches down is 55 degrees for 3 days, which is usually when the lilacs begin blooming. So you need to get this on before the lilacs think about blooming. Usually it's when the forsythia is in full bloom. You put this on because it has to activate a little before it's effective. Corn gluten meal, again, this is something that I've already talked about. It is a pre-emergent. It's more expensive than the chemical counterparts. It's a little less effective than the chemical counterparts as well, but it's got a little bit of nitrogen in it. And again, this might be, you can get it as preen organic. Otherwise, it's a little hard to get a hold of, but sometimes you can get it at feed stores because corn gluten is also used as an animal feed, livestock feed. Post-emergent herbicides are things like the dandelion killer. And again, this, you apply it to the leaves, it goes into the vascular system, works its way down to the root and kills the root. Okay, you have to be careful with these. They can drift and affect non-target plants. They can volatilize. So if the next morning it's a really humid, warm morning, it can kind of create a little cloud that floats over and bothers some other plants. Always make sure that you're applying it when it's not going to rain right away and wash it off. Okay, so that should be on the label for how long it should not rain for. And of course, showers pop up. Okay. Again, herbicides are usually labeled for specific either monocots or dicots, so broadleaf or grass, but non-selective herbicides, that's what Roundup is. Glyphosate is the active ingredient, okay? That will kill anything, whether it's a broadleaf or a grass plant. And if a plant has fuzzy leaves, pubescence, the herbicides may not be as effective. If it has a really thick waxy coating on the leaves, if the leaves are wet from dew, you should not put an herbicide on because that automatically dilutes it. And oddly enough, if the weed is stressed from some other reason, a lot of times it won't take the herbicide up, and so the herbicide doesn't kill it. So weeds get stressed as well. And then one last thing I want to mention is vinegar, because we hear a lot about using vinegar as an herbicide. Vinegar is basically acetic acid, and your typical household vinegar is 5% acetic acid, and it is not going to kill most weeds. If you have a tender young annual that's just popped up, like in that top left picture again, and you spray it with it, it might burn it off and kill it, but it is not going to work on anything that's a biennial or a perennial. Herbicidal vinegars can be, and I saw it on the shelf at Fleet Farm last week, it's 20% acetic acid. And this can burn down older weeds, but it's still a contact herbicide. It kills what it comes in contact with. It does not get systemic. And most perennial weeds, certainly quackgrass, big dandelions, thistles, it is not going to kill them. It might burn the foliage off on the top, but that root's going to come back and shoot back up. So vinegar is usually best used maybe for the cracks in your driveway where annual weeds are popping up in there, maybe pathways, that sort of a thing, but it is not a reliable, good alternative to chemical herbicides. And it can be more expensive if you have to keep using it to burn off a perennial weed that keeps sprouting back. And anything that gets above 11% concentration can burn your skin. So you got to be really careful handling this stuff. And while people think, oh, well, it's organic, there are different ways of making vinegar, including fermentation. If it's made from fermentation, then it's organic. But if it's not, it's actually not even organic. So that's something to remember as well. And then again, the non-selective herbicide, that's like glyphosate, Roundup, lots of other names now because the patent is off of it and stuff like that. This can kill anything, but the problem with it for a lot of people is you spray it and the weed doesn't look dead until about 7 days. It starts yellowing and looking like it's going to die. So you got to be patient. If you spray it, it's dead. It just doesn't know it and won't admit it yet. So don't go and respray it. Okay. For grasses, if you have grasses growing in your perennial bed or something, there are herbicides are specific to grasses that will kill just grasses, but always read the label and use these things appropriately because they can be damaging. This is just a list of some of the common broadleaf herbicides. So the dandelion killers, the lawnweed killers, 2,4-D is the most common, and we call it 2,4-D because of that big long word that starts with the letter D there is hard to pronounce. But dicamba, triclopyr, MCCP or mecoprop are all things that you might see on the label for active ingredients. And if you're really struggling with a particular weed, you need to identify it and then look up what is the best product or the best chemical to control that particular weed, because not all of these chemicals work on all weeds. Okay, so always use them with caution. Remember, they are a tool, but the more we can prevent things, the more we can prevent things from going to seed, the more we can smother things, then we don't have to get into the herbicide use. And so that's probably a good thing. Okay, so get them when they're young. Remember, a lot of them are edible, including that lamb's quarters on the right there. So I sometimes think if we try to cultivate weeds as crops, then they won't grow really well, right? And our tomatoes will be getting in the way of them. So that's it for weeds. And again, this is a big problem. There are lots of different strategies that you should employ, but the biggest one is to get at them early and try to prevent things before they get overgrown and become a jungle. So that's it. If there are any questions, you can always contact me. I forgot to put my contact information up here, but it's dalfuth@wisc.edu. Or you can just look up the UW Extension office for Pierce County, Wisconsin, and you can get my contact information there and bring in any questions as you watch this. So thanks everyone. And again, thank you to the libraries for hosting this.
Hi, Diana. This is Caroline from the Ellsworth Library.
Hi.
We did have a couple of things come through this time. Maria had a question from YouTube. What type of weed is dock and fleabane? It's the worst in my prairie.
And those are broadleaf weeds. Dock is usually a perennial. And fleabane is, actually, I think fleabane is an annual, but I'd have to look that. I think there are both annual and perennial forms of it, but they are technically, I think, both native. So I don't know how much you need to control them, but yeah, dock is definitely a perennial.
Okay. I personally have been having problems with crown vetch. Any suggestions on that one?
Right. And crown vetch is a problem because that was a plant that was encouraged for use for planting because it is really good for like erosion control and stuff. So they planted it on the, sides of highways and things where it was steep and it was going to be this great no-mow grass alternative, but it's really escaped and now it's considered an invasive. So crown vetch, you can kill it off with regular mowing, but you have to mow it, like once a week before it gets leaves up to restore energy into the roots. So regular mowing can usually get it under control. Otherwise, it is considered, it's a legume, but it's considered a broadleaf weed. So any of the broadleaf herbicides will kill it off. And the best time again to do that would probably be in fall, but you can do it right away in the spring too, especially if you get it before it starts flowering.
Okay. And is dock different from burdock? That
Yes.
was-
Yes, so there is dock that's often there's different ones, but like curly dock is one of them, and they get kind of strappy, longer leaves, and they're more related to like amaranth, so they'll get these seed heads on them that are kind of reddish brown and upright. Burdock is the one that it was actually used for the prototype when they invented Velcro, because the burdock gets the purple flowers with the balls of spines on them that stick to you, and those spines all have a tiny little hook on the end, and that's exactly the hook and loop of Velcro. So they look very, very different, and burdock has big wide leaves that kind of look like rhubarb leaves.
Thank you. And the last one we had was, would landscape fabric be a good idea in a garden? And I'm not sure, I don't know, Stacy, if you have more about what kind of garden.
Yeah. Well, if you use it in a vegetable garden, so like between the rows or like around your vining squash or cucumber plants or whatever, yes, it can be good there because it will keep any of the weed seeds that were in the soil from germinating. As I mentioned earlier, though, it is usually black. So as you get into the heat of summer, it's a good idea to put something over it, just like some dried grass clippings or something, so that it doesn't absorb as much heat and overly heat up the root systems of your plants. The disadvantage of it, of course, is you need to peel that up at the end of the year, or if you leave it in place for multiple years, then you're planting in the same place. So sometimes it's a little bit harder to do good crop rotation, but you can leave it in there for multiple years. Eventually it does start to break down, especially if it's getting any of the UV rays from the sunlight hitting it. And then it can be kind of pain to deal with, but it definitely can work in a vegetable garden. And if it's a flower garden, like I said, flower gardens, the only place a landscape fabric should be under a mulch in a long-term bed would be if you were using rock mulch, because then that's what stops the weeds from germinating. Most plants don't like rock mulch, and unfortunately it becomes a maintenance problem a few years down the line because of all the dust and dirt that falls on the rock and then settles on top of that landscape fabric, and then weed seeds get down there too, and the weeds start growing in the rocks on top of that fabric and that sort of a thing. So so that's why typically landscape fabrics don't have much use anywhere.
Thank you very much. I think that was our, oh, let's see, something else just popped up on YouTube. It says, help, my daughter planted snake grass in my perennial bed. It went crazy. It doesn't seem to die with Roundup. What can I do?
Yeah, and that is, again, that's a monocot. Roundup should control it, but again, not all plants are susceptible to herbicides. So even like Siberian iris, I have a Siberian iris that I want to get rid of, and Roundup doesn't kill it, I found. So your options are, you can try one of the products that is specifically a grass killer and see if that's a little bit more effective on it. Otherwise, obviously you can sit there and if your daughter planted it, make her dig it all up, right? Or if there are splotches of it, if you can smother it, and mulch is probably not going to be enough to smother it, but if you use like boards or old pieces of carpet or, really heavy duty things like that you can put on and leave in place for a month, sometimes you can smother out some of the bigger patches of it and then dig out some of the other ones of it and stress it down with herbicides, and good luck. There are a few weeds that are really, really hard to get rid of no matter how you look at it.